Chapter 21 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or An Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 21. Unseen Forces. There was a moment of disturbed silence. Robert had not before realized that it would make any special difference to him what Hester thought. If she was getting squeamish, he felt that it would be very inconvenient. At last she came to the rescue with a frank little laugh. "I know I don't act like myself, Robert, not a bit, and I don't feel at all like myself. I don't know what is the matter with me. Miss Mason said the queerest thing this morning, just before Sunday school was over. I never had anything make me feel so in my life, and I'm sure I don't know why it does. I'm not apt to pay much attention to what she says. Between you and me, I don't think there is enough of her to keep anybody's attention. She isn't a bit like Joy Saunders, nor like that awfully in earnest Dr. Everett that you admire so much. Oh my, I guess she isn't. But this morning she didn't feel like herself either, I guess. Anyhow, she said a queer thing. We girls hadn't been behaving very well. Oh, we hadn't done anything so very bad, you know, but we whispered some, and 2 or 3 funny things happened, and we laughed. We worried her, I guess. At last she said, and she looked right at me when she said it, 'Oh, girls, when the Lord sees you, what will he say?' Wasn't that strange? I can't help thinking of it. All the time Dr. Everett was closing, I kept saying the words over. Of course, you know he will see us sometime, though I don't believe I ever thought of it before. I'll tell you what it is, Rob. If I were you, I would rather meet him somewhere else than on the cars." "Pooh," said Robert. As a rule, he was more polite to ladies, but this feature of Hester's character annoyed him exceedingly, the more so because he had a certain startled feeling that what she said was true. For some reason unknown to himself, that old truth struck him strangely. They walked on, Hester talking eagerly, and growing more and more earnest in her determination to carry her point. "I don't care," she said, in the free and decidedly unconventional way she had of talking with gentlemen. "I believe it, and so do you, that one of these days I shall have to meet him and answer his questions. I don't see why I shouldn't be careful when I think of it. I never did before, and perhaps I never shall again." "Oh, well," Robert said coldly, "I suppose you will have to do as you will, but I must say I am sorry you chose this particular day on which to try your experiment. I had looked forward to giving you a day of pleasure." "Then give it me," she answered eagerly. "I don't want you to go on that train a bit. I can't, to save my life, tell why, and I dare say I am acting like a fool. But I think you ought to humor me once in a while, because you know I don't indulge in this line very often." "What do you want me to do?" Robert asked, and there was indecision in his tones. This curious Hester was growing interesting. He had never heard her coax before. She was generally entirely and gaily willing to carry out his plans. Still, half the anticipated pleasure of the day had been in thinking what Hester would say to the sights he meant to show her. Besides, what would young Barrows say to him for deserting him in this fashion, when he had exhausted half an hour but the evening before in overcoming that young gentleman's scruples to the Sunday excursion? "I promised Barrows I would meet him at the train," he said, but Hester detected the tone of irresolution in his voice. "Send him word that you can't come," she said, her eyes bright and expectant. "I'm sure I am of more importance than Austin Barrows, and I never asked you to do anything for me before." Whether Robert would have settled the matter as he did, could he have had a longer time for decision, will not be known. But at that moment there came, with long strides down the street, one who he knew was going on the excursion. Here was a chance to send a message, if he had really given it up. "Hello, Fred," he said. "Going to the train? I guess I want you to take a message to Barrows for me. You'll find him there, I presume." "Hurry up, then. Make your story short. It is 10 minutes of starting time. I thought you were going to the train yourself." "Changed my mind," said Robert shortly. tearing a leaf from his note-book and writing rapidly, while the young man in waiting stared curiously at Hester. "There," said Robert Parks, when he had delivered the note and the messenger had departed. "I've done a very strange thing for your benefit. I really hope you appreciate it. What are we supposed to do next?" His tone tried to be gay, but in reality it was almost cross. He was unused to having his plans turned aside in this fashion. It was a surprise to him that he had submitted to it. "Now," said Hester, with infinite satisfaction, "I want you to take me to church." "Upon my word," Robert said, almost pausing in the street to look at her, "I shall have to get acquainted with you over again. You are blossoming out in a new character altogether. Is there any special church which we are supposed to honor with our presence this morning?" "Yes," Hester said, with a satisfied giggle. There was a stranger to preach at the Olin Street Church. He had been in the store with Mr. Hudson the night before, and he was really handsome. She wanted to hear how he would preach. Besides, she was tired of Dr. Miller and all the folks at the Packard Place Church. She wanted some new ones to look at. It was actually just such reasons as these that took these two to the Olin Street Church that Sabbath morning. That is, these were the only moving forces visible to them. "This night thy soul shall be required of thee." These were the words which the young minister announced as his text. Hester Mason hardly heard them. She admired the perfect fitting clerical dress, and the fine height and well-developed form of the preacher, and whispered to Robert that he had a really splendid voice. But Robert scarcely heard her. The words of the text had thrilled through him like an electric shock. He had heard them before, was indeed tolerably familiar with the story from which they were taken. They had never made any marked impression on his mind before. Why should they now? There was certainly a startling connection between the thought which they suggested and the one which had roused Hester. He glanced at the girl to see if she noticed it, but Hester, apparently, had entirely satisfied her conscience by coming to church and prevailing on him to do the same. Once there, she had no idea of listening. She was at that moment giving attention to a new style of collar worn by a fashionable lady just in front of her, trying to decide whether it would be possible to imitate it with the aid of some old lace in a certain box at the store that she could get for a trifle. Robert Parks, seeing the indifference on her face, was annoyed at the feeling which possessed him, and tried hard to throw it off. He twirled his cane and gazed about him, he even rustled the leaves of the hymn book, which on ordinary occasions he would have thought rude. It was all to no purpose. He could not get away from the solemn words which seemed staring at him and obliging him to listen. "Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee." "Young man," said the preacher, bending over the open Bible and speaking in a singularly low and impressive tone, "what if this word from the Lord should apply to you?" Robert gave a sudden nervous start, which seemed to him so marked that the blood rushed to his face, and he looked about him in dismay to see whether he had been noticed. To his excited imagination it seemed as though the preacher was looking right at him, speaking to him directly. Well, how was he to answer the question? What if it should be his case? It was possible, certainly. Suppose it were certain, what then? It was of no use for the young man to change his position and declare that he would not listen to a word the speaker was saying, that he was nothing but a young fanatic. He could no more hush the questioning voice of the Holy Spirit striving with his heart than he could will to have that heart suddenly cease its beating. You are to remember that he was a well-taught young man, that from his youth up he had been familiar with the commonly accepted doctrines of Christianity. He knew perfectly well that he had been fighting against this whole question for weeks. He had heard the repeated calls to his conscience. He knew that not only his mother, but Dr. Everett and Joy Saunders, and perhaps others, were making him a special subject of prayer. Sometimes the thought of this had irritated him. He had never resented his mother's prayers. It had seemed eminently fitting that she should weep and pray for her son. But sometimes he felt as though he should like to ask the rest of them to be kind enough to let him alone. At the same time, He was aware that he ought to be ashamed of this feeling, and in a sense was ashamed of it. There had been times during the last few months when he had been on the very verge of settling this whole question, when he had said to himself, "I believe I will take a new start and live a Christian life. I really mean to do it some time. Why not now as well as any?" Yet perhaps in 10 minutes his entire mood would change, and he would feel himself farther than ever from the decision. But this Sabbath morning he was passing through a new experience. There came to him a feeling, searching and solemn, that it must be now or never with him; that the time had come when the long-waiting, long-insulted spirit demanded a decision; and that if he made it a negative one, so far as he was concerned, his soul might as well go to the judgment that night as at any other time, for the question would be settled. He could not get away from the belief that he had trifled with this matter just as long as it was safe. In one respect Robert Parks had the advantage of some young men. He had toyed with skepticism, it is true; he had told himself angrily, many a time, that he did not believe in this religion at all; but having been fairly well educated and having a really clear, logical mind, he had never even for an hour convinced himself that he believed such statements as these. In reality, he knew, as well as he knew he was alive, that he, for instance, was a sinner, and that Christ was a Savior. He knew that nothing but his own will lay between him and safety. Certainly it was a very unsafe thing for a man to dally with such light as this. He did not hear very much of the sermon; a stray sentence now and then, delivered with all the earnestness of an earnest soul intent on his Maker's business, God used to deepen this soul's sense of responsibility. But for most of the time the battle was fought between his will and God's; that old battle which must always, sooner or later, be fought before Satan loses his hold on the struggling soul. Chapter 22.